Back live with you tonight, and thanks for staying on. Let's take it back now to one of our leading stories. The government has resolved to terminate the national state of disaster on energy with immediate effect. Comes after opposition political parties and civil society groups piled on the pressure, arguing that the move flouted existing legislation. In response, government says the appointment of Minister Dr. Kgosientsho Ramokgopa was a significant factor to the improvement in electricity supply. Here to help us get a sense and understanding of some of these issues, we're joined by Solidarity Research Institute head Connie Mulder, as well as the South African Energy Forum Executive Director Hlathi Madela. Gentlemen, good evening. Thank you for your time tonight here on In Focus.
Good evening, Tabu.
Good evening, Tabu. Good evening to the listeners.
Let me begin with you, Connie, because I saw a note earlier on. I just can't get to it now, but in the note that came from you earlier on, a statement, so to speak, you seem to be taking credit for this withdrawal. My colleague Tembegile Khototo earlier on speaking to the COCTA minister, she says, well, if you look back at what was happening in early February, the sustainable provision of electricity was a thing that we were not even thinking about. In fact, she says we were close to a blackout. And so it was a decision that was necessary at the time to put us into a state of disaster. What do you say?
From our perspective, I think it's quite clear that this is not government acting out of its own volition. This is government being forced by the threat of litigation with a meeting on the 12th of April with a judge that they are desperately trying to avoid, and thus now suddenly arbitrarily out of the blue terminating the state of disaster and then writing us a letter from the state attorney that specifically asks us to withdraw our legal application, but as well as that offering to pay the costs of our legal application as well as that of OTA. So this is not something that government has done because they've suddenly reviewed. It's quite simple that the threat of legal action, what we know is their own legal advice would have inevitably told them that this doesn't stand a chance in court. We know this from the fact that in their opposing affidavit, when we looked at the minutes of the meetings leading up to the state of disaster, up to 2 days before the state of disaster, COCTA minister at that point, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, was still adamant that a state of disaster is not necessary to handle the energy crisis. There are more than enough adequate legislative instruments. And then suddenly, within 48 hours, they switched, they turned around and instigated this. And from our perspective, this is a very important precedent that we set, that you cannot mismanage the country into a disaster and then give yourself more powers through a state of disaster to try and alleviate it. You should use the legislative instruments that you've got, and if you can't use them, or if you don't have the right people, then you should fire the incompetent ministers and get people who can actually use them.
But Madela, it seems government was in view of information that maybe the rest of us as South Africans were not particularly in view of, and part of that information was that we were very close to a blackout, and that, as the president put it, the energy crisis was now not just about lights coming off, but it was becoming an existential threat to the economy and the social fabric of society. And therefore, it was the correct decision at the time. We'll talk about what things have changed now, but at that time would have been a perfect call. What's the view of the South African Energy Forum?
Absolutely, Tawa, and to the listeners, it was really a necessary call for the president and the government to declare the state of disaster so that we would be able to arrest the situation and have some of these stringent laws that we don't know and regulations where they came from, because they seem to be suiting one group of people, but they don't suit anything that's got to do with the state. So that enabled them to prioritize the country before the pride of wanting to close down our power stations. You were there when Eskom said they had brought 6 units back, and the Minister of Electricity has been hard at work encouraging people to tell him what's going on. There are power stations that were due for closure and some units that were due for closure. And that enables him to speak to the president and say, I can't close this in favor of new power coming from renewable wind and solar. So it was a necessary call, but just to add, it still remains a necessary call. It's premature for them to chicken out and cancel the state of disaster. But we will talk about that another day, because I want to ask the questions in terms of what the state of disaster would have enabled this government to say, what changes? Do you need a state of disaster to do those or not? I've got all of them, 5 of them here that are written by the government.
Yeah.
You don't need a state of disaster. You just need a strong government to push.
Absolutely. We're going to get into those. I mean, the president saying we needed immediate extraordinary measures. One of those extraordinary measures was the exemption, for example, of essential services like hospitals, like water treatment plants from load shedding. Another one of those was the ability to buy additional power from neighboring countries on emergency basis. Another one of those was assisting businesses, for example, in making generators available, solar panels, and more other aspects of energy generation or alternative energy generation widely available. But 2 was really by and large to accelerate the response to the ongoing energy crisis. Connie, did in the 7 weeks when I'm assuming, of course, the president spoke on the 9th of February, it's 7 weeks later now, regulations, of course, were probably gazetted about a month later or so. But in that period, were any of those things done to get us to where we are today?
Yes, Tyler. So just back to the initial reason for this is we had the threat of a blackout, theoretically. And we have several members at National Control who have assured us that blackouts in the world history happen due to transmission failure, not due to generation failure, which means we are as close to a blackout now as we were in February, as we were in 2018. Natural disaster or sabotage would be the things that actually cause a total blackout. Once you're in load shedding, that is meant to protect the system. And that means as long as we're in stages of load shedding, we're avoiding the situation where we get the whole network collapsing. So it's just all of this was political theatre. What we've seen is that the regulations that were published under the state of disaster were really whimsical. They basically were the Kokta minister delegating powers to the ministers that they already had. We have seen some action on that front in terms of regulations, exemptions from the PFMA as one, the environmental exemption for building the chimney chutes. That is exactly what we needed. But none of that needed the state of disaster to be done. And that was our point from the very start, is we do not need to be in a state of disaster to enact the legislation that we need to get out of this crisis. And that is what makes us angry, is government now terminating the state of disaster is an implicit acknowledgement that they've had the tools. They've had the tools for years, and they've been able to actually address this crisis for years. The political will just did not exist. Now, suddenly there's a sense of urgency that has happened, and we welcome that sense of urgency. But then at the same time, government giving themselves really almost unfettered power through a state of disaster is something that we quite simply had to put a stop to. We've seen the abuses during COVID, and if you look at Eskom, the energy crisis and the energy sector's history of corruption, then it's a very dangerous tightrope if you're giving unfettered power to government in this sector, which is why we're specifically against the state of disaster, but we're not against getting out of the energy crisis. There are certain things that can be done. Acquiring new energy, the Minister of Department of Mineral Resources and Energy can do tomorrow. He can gazette that we need to acquire emergency procurement of 6,000 megawatt or however much we need. He in fact did exactly this in July of 2020 when he said we need 2,000 megawatts of emergency power. For some reason, now he can't do that unless there's a state of disaster. In the same sense, getting people onto the grid, we need NERSA to publish a guideline for feed-in tariffs as well as a proper guideline for wheeling tariffs so that we can get bigger private commercial players who can actually do a proper pricing and a proper business plan. This can be done without being in a state of disaster. This can be done tomorrow as well if necessary. And lastly, appointing a Minister of Electricity is something that the Constitution gives the President the power to do. He does not need a state of disaster to appoint a new ministry. He alone decides how big his executive should be. So we're of the opinion all of this was just political theatre to look like you're doing something instead of actually doing something. So luckily some of these things are happening, and the government then today acknowledges this in as much in terminating the state of disaster, but then stating the steps that we took will not be impacted by this at all, which means we actually took no steps or regulations under the state of disaster. It was completely unnecessary.
So the question by Madela was put to the Minister of Cogta to say, well, what now that the state of disaster has been removed? How are you going to achieve these expedited measures? She says, well, the PFMA has measures in place, for example, for things like emergency energy procurement, which they had said when they put the state of disaster in place, these regulations, I'm reading from the website, enable emergency procurement in line with the Public Finance Management Act, Municipal Finance Management Act, and the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act. They do, however, make specific provision for the affected accounting officers to report on regular intervals to the Auditor General on expenditure incurred in implementing these regulations. Did any of that take place in the 7 weeks when the state of disaster was in place? Now that we know, of course, that we really didn't need the state of disaster to be in place for this to happen.
Well, it did, even though it's not quite measurable that much in terms of anything outside Eskom. All we've seen a lot of improvement inside Eskom, where there's been a change of mindset to say, take what you already have, just sweat it properly, and you can get to stabilize the electricity back. So the problem that I have, I think I'm in agreement with Connie Mulder to say, really, there's nothing there that they have done, that they still need to do, that required them to declare the state of disaster. They may be that they're very much confused and they fear the NGOs that seem to oppose anything that has got to do with the government. It's quite comforting to hear from Connie Mulder, from Outer and from AfriForum to say, government, you have to do these things. You don't need a state of disaster. So to answer your question, I'm quite surprised that the Minister of Cogta seems to be contradicting herself on one hand, saying that now with this being removed, the state of disaster, they can still be able to tap into the emergency procurement. Of course, they don't need the state of disaster for that. But from what they've done, to summarize, there's nothing that needed them to have a state of... Let me give you a complicated one. Minister Mantashe wants to procure the power ships in the event we still need them. All we have to do is to say, don't do it via a tender. Get a proper consultant to do it on behalf of the government for the duration that you need. You don't need a state of disaster for that. The Minister of Fisheries and Forests and Environmental Affairs has given them a leeway to bring back and expedite bringing 3 units in Kgosientsho, which is going to bring 2,100 in November this year. You don't need a state of disaster. You just need to sit with the Minister of DFFE and reason this thing out and say, I will correct it 24 months later. So really, there's nothing in any of these interventions that we need to do that requires us to declare a state of disaster. But I feel for the government, because it's a coward government, it gets taken to court by the NGOs, it gets taken to court by Outer. In this instance, I'm not going to get involved after taking them for the state of disaster, because I still repeat, they don't need a state of disaster. They just need to be a present government that takes its job very seriously to procure power for the state and procure power for the private players. Right now, I can tell you now, people like Connie Mulder and all of that, they favor the private part of things. But why is the government not procuring power using the state institutions? Why isn't the government talking to the other players who want to do the business with the state in terms of the public-private partnership? It's because they will be taken to court and they're going to chicken out and they're not going to accept that they are government. They're not those people who take them to court.
Welcome back. Government withdraws the state of disaster on electricity. What does this mean? What tools do they have going forward to expedite and accelerate the addressing of the energy crisis? Connie Mulder, head of Solidarity's Research Institute, joining us, as well as the South African Energy Forum Executive Director, Hlathi Madela. Connie, let's look at one area where maybe it could be said that not much has really been achieved. One of the points that were put on as far as the regulations are concerned, they say the regulations will be able to protect consumers from excessive pricing of goods and services, and availability of the supply of goods and services will be secured during the national state of disaster. Well, prices have gone up incredibly high. In some instances, there are, of course, questions being asked about the competitive nature of how those prices have gone up. Hence, the Competition Commission is currently going through a process of an inquiry. So the point was, having the state of disaster in place would somehow protect consumers from excessive price increases. With that state of disaster being off, how are consumers going to be protected now?
Mulder, I don't think the state of disaster would have done a good job of protecting consumers. The reason for most of these price increases is that the cost of doing business has gone up. If your power is off for 10 hours a day, somehow you need to get energy. And in many of these cases, that means running a generator, which gets very expensive if you're running it for 10 hours a day for 2 or 3 weeks. So ultimately, unfortunately, the cost would have to be borne somewhere. And most companies pass that on to the consumer. I don't think that's going to help a lot, having the state of disaster in place. We can say that this should be the price, but the market simply does not work that way. If you're in a free market situation, the consumer and the producer basically decides through price signals what is the correct price here. Do remember that in the world at the moment, we're in an inflationary crunch as well, where inflation is out of control in the USA, or not completely out of control, it's just in South African levels in the USA. But in the rest of the world as well, which means prices increasing is more a direct result of prices increasing worldwide, as well as energy costs locally due to generators and not having energy, but as well as due to oil being still stubbornly high and increasing fuel prices. So that means we can try and legislate the market out of this, but if you're linked to an international market, you're to some degree beholden to forces that you cannot truly legislate at any point. And that means it's a bit of hubris to think you're going to be able to do this. It's not the same like in the COVID one, where we had proper price gouging controls with people charging 500% for masks and new produce that was necessary. This is just a normal situation. It's food production. It's all of these. What is interesting is that government stated in one of the reasons that they're into the state of disaster is to protect or to exempt the food industry from load shedding where technically feasible. But this is already possible. I think it's regulation NRS 048-9 that determines who gets load shedding and who doesn't. The main problem with the agricultural sector is it's almost technically impossible to exempt them without then switching on whole residential areas in municipalities as well, which means there was a call to say exempt small business, but this would not be possible due to the way the network or the grid is set up to do. And that they had this little catch-all that says if technically feasible, and it just plain simply isn't. But once again, it's something that can be changed without going into a state of disaster.
So I think, sorry, Connie, one of the areas that they would have, I suppose, assisted consumers in was funding interventions, relief schemes that would have been offered to farmers and maybe even retailers under the state of disaster, which could have been a cushion, I suppose, and a buffer for consumers from paying high costs.
I understand, yeah. So from our perspective, remember the state of disaster was announced way before the budget, and there is nothing stopping government from saying we need to increase social assistance to some vulnerable sectors because load shedding has hit quite hard. They then chose during the budget to not refer to the state of disaster once and to not really do any of those measures that would have been within their power. But this, once again, does not require us to be in a state of disaster to do. South Africa can very easily, if necessary, amend the budget. We can say we need an emergency budget if it has to be, but we didn't even need that. We had just the normal budget speech 2 weeks after the declaration of the state of disaster, and they didn't do anything regarding that. I think the reason, quite simply, is that the money is finished. There is no more money to do this. The one thing that we did announce during the budget, which once again was not linked to the state of disaster, is tax incentives for businesses as well as individuals to get solar panels on their roof and to get themselves off the grid, to relieve some pressure on the grid. Now, this seems to have worked quite well, as NERSA has registered more than 1,000 megawatts of private generation projects in the year-to-date up till March. This compares quite well with the whole of 2022, where NERSA registered 1,600 megawatts for the whole year. So we're more than 70% there to the year total with after 3 months already. So it seems that the direction we're going is generation is rapidly coming online in the private sector. Our focus now needs to shift to make sure that these private generators get connected to the network and is actually and are able to sell these electrons to consumers who so desperately need it.
But Madela, putting on your other hat now as a business person as well, I mean, there's a question of other sectors who are still feeling that, as you're saying, it's maybe too early to pull the plug, even though we didn't need to have the state of disaster. But for them, it feels like it would have allowed them to have funding interventions, relief schemes. They need some regulatory-based relief at this particular point, telecommunications being one of them, who have been hard hit by the loss of power. What was done, particularly around that space of relief?
Well, I'm not familiar with the thing that you just said, with the businesses that have benefited, that would have benefited other than Eskom itself. I'm aware of those ones that would have been excused to implement load shedding. So my thing here, to digress from your question, is that, to be honest, there's nothing wrong with the Eskom power system. All that we have a team of people that have allowed themselves to be in this big confusion, where when you have a problem with the power system and it results in problems in other areas like telecom and the hospitals and all the people that you count, somebody looks for an alternative solution to go and bail those out rather than going back to correct what has gone wrong. All we need is to ask ourselves, what do we do to take ourselves back and use what we have and stop this unnecessary load shedding? So I don't follow when people start saying that, you know what, the state of disaster or the government being able to implement these measures would have benefited so and so. I have never heard of the private sector making life easy for the people. Those institutions that we are talking about, they are there for the private sector. They are there to make money for themselves. And no telecom is half government owned and half privately owned. You make an example of that. But let's talk about other businesses which are not necessarily owned by government. These people who want to provide power, who want to be an alternative to Eskom, they are there for the profit and they are there for the money. The question is, do they really believe that they are going to give us a much better cost factors compared to the government? The situation at the moment currently shows that the production of electricity by Eskom is far cheaper than the one that can be produced by the private sector. Until these people come and tell us that their offer of the electricity production is comparable to Eskom, then of course we should support them. But right now, all they are doing, they're saying, Eskom, you are vulnerable. Stay there because you can't go to the market and raise the money. Let us step in and pretend that we can provide the power, but let's not ask the actual total system cost to the consumer. And that's where the disconnect is. And I keep going back to say, let us fix Eskom. Let us not escalate the problem to the other players like the consumers, hospital, telecom, and all the others. We're going to end up fixing too many problems because of one problem that we refuse to fix, which is Eskom.
Are we fixing Eskom, Madela, with the electricity minister now in place? The Kgosientsho minister seems to be placing a lot of faith in the Minister of Electricity as being the reason why, for example, Cabinet even sat down and said, well, now that we have this ministry that is specifically looking at fixing Eskom, do we still need to have the state of disaster in place, or are they doing enough to, in the words, put systems in place for sustainable provision of electricity?
Again, I'm going to go back to what Connie Mulder said, that we don't need the state of disaster to fix these problems. We just need to have a present government. But knowing our government, how it operates, it gets scared by the NGOs, it gets intimidated by anybody that threatens to take it to court. Now, if they believe as a government, in order for them to be able to do all of this is by declaring the state of disaster, then I'm saying, you being a coward government, perhaps that will help you. But the real answer is that we don't need a state of disaster. Even the things that they count here, even the interventions that Minister Ramokgopa has implemented, none of them need a state of disaster. We are heading towards a situation where we may even be on stage 1 load shedding, or we may not have load shedding at all by the end of the year. But all those things that we have to do, they don't require a state of disaster. They just need the government that looks at what other countries are doing. Just to give an example without laboring the point, In Germany, they are digging a new mine. They are moving people from the village. They are arresting Greta Thunberg. They are doing all of these things. They didn't have to declare a state of disaster. They just had to say, we are a government of this country. We need to implement what works. Now, why do we need things like state of disaster instead of having a government that says, listen, it's my responsibility to provide the power. Businesses and communities are being inconvenienced. Put the power ships, bring back Kusile, bring back some of the units that have been neglected. Let the good private sector be part of the solution. None of these things need a state of disaster.
Yeah. Is the electricity minister, my question is, the electricity minister taking that approach? Is that the thinking that you are beginning to see, at least in the last 2 months that he's been on?
Exactly. That's what he has done, because he's the first one to say to us, I've brought back 6 units. And I can tell you now, we were promised an additional 1,806, which is literally 40 kilowatts short of 2,000 by end of March. We are going to ask if he's been able to achieve that. If that was achieved, then we shouldn't be having more than a stage 2 of load shedding from May going forward. Again, we will see how winter treats us, but with the request that is made to the DFFE and him having promised that he's going to go to the president and ask the president to delay the closure of the coal power stations that are due to be closed down in order to make way for the renewables. If he succeeds to tell the president, I can't shut down Camden, I can't shut down these units that are still operating, he will achieve his missions. Again, he doesn't need the state of disaster. He just needs to ask the very critical question, why are we having to close down a unit that is currently producing power at the moment? At the heart of this, you will know that the money that is being made to the South African government, $8.6 billion US, it is on conditions that whenever you want to tap into it, you must close down a coal power station. So now the minister must say to the president, which one must I do? Must I inconvenience the country by closing down a power station unit, a coal power station unit, in order for the private sector to have their money on the $8.6 billion US, or must I continue with that? So far, he's demonstrated that he's willing to go and tell the president, I'm discovering something that is contrary to what has been agreed on the back of $8.6 billion US that says close down the coal power station so that the private sector can plug the renewable wind and solar by tapping into that money.
Connie, can electricity minister take credit for the 6 units that are back and I suppose the delay in the closure of particular power stations?
I don't think it's the electricity minister that got us out of the current load shedding situation. We need to also remember that we're still in stage 4. If Eskom's planning, which they released today, is to be believed, we will have load shedding every single week of this year, which quite simply means Eskom is not generating enough power to actually power the country. That is why we're in the energy crisis we're in. Eskom simply cannot do it alone. Now, we're not saying abandon Eskom. Obviously, Eskom will always be a part of the future energy mix. But we need to realize that any new generation capacity that we add will be added by the private sector. Government seems to have realized this by budgeting nothing for adding new generation capacity from within the state. All of this will come from private commercial players. The Minister of Electricity is not going to be able to get new capacity online if he's only going to focus on Eskom. His focus needs to shift to saying, how do we, number one, unbundle Eskom and decentralize the power generation situation? How do we make sure that we get private commercial players online? Because ultimately, electricity is just a consumer good like any other good that is produced by the private sector and then sold on a market. And that is where we need to be going, to a wholesale market for electricity, as we've seen happen with cell phones, as we've seen happen with fiber internet, as we see happen every single day with vegetables and other produce that we consume. There's no reason this shouldn't be the situation that we're aiming for. As long as the Minister of Electricity does not go that way, if he's going to bet everything on Eskom alone solving this problem, then we're going to be in load shedding for a very, very long time. In fact, this winter we'll be in stage 4 for almost every single month of the winter. If Eskom's planning is to be believed, we will have load shedding every week of this year. And if we continue on this path of saying that it's only going to be Eskom and the government that solves this, rather than finally allowing the private and community sector to solve this problem, we'll have load shedding next year, and then we'll have worse load shedding the year after that. The only way forward is to make sure that we get electrons onto this grid, for government to step aside as far as it can get out of the way and allow the private sector to quite simply solve this problem, as we've seen in every single other country in the world. When the private sector gets involved, yes, they make money, but the consumer gets better services at a better price. We've seen it happen here. We've seen it happen in China. We've seen it happen in every single place where you've got a government institution competing against the private sector. And that is why we're saying this is the way to solve this energy crisis.
Yeah.
Let's not try and get power out of Eskom that it just simply cannot deliver anymore. We need to stabilize Eskom. We need to make sure it's stable and that it's still part of the energy mix in the future, quite obviously. But we need to be realistic about South Africa's energy needs and where that energy needs will be met from.
Because of time, I'm going to have to leave it there. But Madela, I'll bring you back to talk about the other thing that you had promised you want to share with us at a later stage. But I appreciate you both. Thank you very much for coming on. Tonight, Connie Mulder, Head of Solidarity Research Institute, and Hlathi Madela, South African Energy Forum Executive Director. Some of your thoughts tonight on 072-110-5584. That is on WhatsApp. Here's what you had to say tonight. This one from Tebogo in Pretoria, Evening Tabo. The government just wanted to be seen to be doing something. You can really tell by the statement made by the Minister of Kokta. Same as the public protector hearing the chairperson wants to be seen to be doing something, yet creating more problems. Those are some of your thoughts there tonight.